Chapter 6, Part 2 of The Burial of the Guns. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Burial of the Guns by Thomas Nelson Page. Chapter 6, Part 2. Little Darby. There were few houses in the district or in the county where lights did not burn all that night. The gleam of the fire in Mrs. Stanley's little house could be seen all night from the door of the Mills cabin, as the candle by which Mrs. Mills complained while she and Vashti sewed could be faintly seen from Little Darby's house. The two Mills boys slept stretched out on the one bed in the little center room. While the women sewed and talked fitfully by the single tallow candle, an old cove dozed in a chair with his long legs stretched out toward the fire, and the two shining barrels of his son's muskets resting against his knees where they had slipped from his hands when he had finished rubbing them. The younger woman did most of the sewing. Her fingers were suppler than her mother's, and she scarcely spoke except to answer the latter's querulous questions. Presently a rooster crowed somewhere in the distance, and almost immediately another crowed in answer closer to hand. "There's the second rooster crow. It's getting near long toward the morning," said the elder woman. The young girl made no answer, but a moment later rose and, laying aside the things she was sewing, walked to the low door and stepped out into the night. When she returned and picked up her sewing again, her mother said, "I declare, Vashti, you drinks more water than anybody I ever see." To which she made no answer. "Air they a stirring over at Mis' Stanley's?" asked the mother. "They ain't a been to bed," said the girl quietly, and then, as if a sudden thought had struck her, she hitched her chair nearer the door which she had left open, and sat facing it as she sewed on the brown thing she was working on a small bow which she took from her dress. "I declare I don't see what old Mrs. Stanley is actually a-gwine to do," broke out Mrs. Mills suddenly, and when Vashti did not feel called on to try to enlighten her, she added, "Do you?" "Same as other folks, I suppose," said the girl quietly. "Other folks has somebody to take keer on 'em. I've got your pappy now, but she ain't got nobody but little Darby, and when he's gone what will she do?" For answer Vashti only hitched her chair a little nearer the door and sewed on almost in darkness. "Not that he was much account to her, nor to anybody else, except for goin' around a fightin' and a fussin'." "He was account to her," flamed up the girl suddenly. "He was account to her and to everybody else. He was the first soldier that 'listed, and he is account to everybody." The old woman had raised her head in astonishment at her daughter's first outbreak, and was evidently about to reply sharply, but the girl's flushed face and flashing eyes awed and silenced her. "Well, well, I ain't sayin' nothin' against him," she said presently. "Yes, you are. You're always saying something against him, and so is everybody else, and they ain't fitting to tie his shoes. Why don't they say it to his face? There ain't one of 'em as dares it, and he's the best soldier in the company, and I'm just as proud of it as if he was my own." The old woman was evidently bound to defend herself. She said, "It don't lay in your mouth to take up for him, Vashti Mills, for you're the one as has gone up and down and abused him scandalous." "Yes, and I know I did," said the girl, springing up excitedly and tossing her arms and tearing at her ribbons. "And I told him to his face, too, and that's the only good thing about it. I knowed it was a lie when I told him, and he knowed it was a lie, too, and he knowed I knowed it was a lie, what's more, and I'm glad he did. 'Fore God, I'm glad he did. He could 'a' whipped the whole company, and he just wouldn't. And that's God's truth, God's fatal truth." The next instant she was on her knees hunting for something on the floor in an agony of tears, and as her father, aroused by the noise, rose and asked a question, she sprang up and rushed out of the door. The sound of an axe was already coming through the darkness across the gum thickets from Mrs. Stanley's, telling that preparation was being made for Darby's last breakfast. It might have told more, however, by its long continuance, for it meant that little Darby was cutting his mother a supply of wood to last till his return. Inside, the old woman, thin and faded, was rubbing his musket. The sun was just rising above the pines, filling the little bottom between the cabins with a sort of rosy light, and making the dewy bushes and weeds sparkle with jewel-strung gossamer webs, when little Darby, with his musket in his hand, stepped for the last time out of the low door. He had been the first soldier in the district to enlist; he must be on time. He paused just long enough to give one swift glance around the little clearing, and then set out along the path at his old swinging pace. At the edge of the pines he turned and glanced back. His mother was standing in the door, but whether she saw him or not he could not tell. He waved his hand to her, but she did not wave back; her eyes were failing somewhat. The next instant he disappeared in the pines. He had crossed the little stream on the old log and passed the point where he had met Vashti the evening before, when he thought he heard something fall a little ahead of him. It could not have been a squirrel, for it did not move after it fell. His old hunter's instinct caused him to look keenly down the path as he turned the clump of bushes which stopped his view, but he saw no squirrel or other moving thing. The only thing he saw was a little brown something with a curious spot on it, lying in the path some little way ahead. As he came nearer it, he saw that it was a small parcel not as big as a man's fist. Someone had evidently dropped it the evening before. He picked it up and examined it as he strode along. It was a little case or wallet made of some brown stuff, such as women carry needles and thread in, and it was tied up with a bit of red, white, and blue string, the Confederate colors, on the end of which was sewed a small bow of pink ribbon. He untied it. It was what it looked to be, a roughly made little needle case such as women use, tolerably well stocked with sewing materials, and it had something hard and almost square in a separate pocket. Darby opened this, and his gun almost slipped from his hand. Inside was the Testament he had given back to Vashti the evening before. He stopped stock still and gazed at it in amazement, turning it over in his hand. He recognized the bow of pink ribbon as one like that which she had had on her dress the evening before. She must have dropped it. Then it came to him that she must have given it to one of her brothers, and a pang shot through his heart. But how did it get where he found it? He was too keen a woodsman not to know that no footstep had gone before his on that path that morning. It was a mystery too deep for him, and after puzzling over it a while, he tied the parcel up again as nearly like what it had been before as he could, and determined to give it to one of the Mills boys when he reached the crossroads. He unbuttoned his jacket and put it into the little inner pocket, and then rebuttoning it carefully, stepped out again more briskly than before. It was perhaps an hour later that the Mills boys set out for the crossroads. Their father and mother went with them, but Vashti did not go. She had been out to look for the cow, and got in only just before they left, still clad in her yesterday's finery, but it was wet and bedraggled with the soaking dew. When they were gone she sat down in the door, limp and dejected. More than once during the morning the girl rose and started down the path as if she would follow them and see the company set out on its march. But each time she came back and sat down again in the door, remaining there for a good while, as if in thought. Once she almost went over to Mrs. Stanley's, then turned back and sat down again. So the morning passed, and the first thing she knew, her father and mother had returned. The company had started. They were to march to the bridge that night. She heard them talking over the appearance that they had made, the speech of the captain, the cheers that went up as they marched off, the enthusiasm of the crowd. Her father was in much excitement. Suddenly she seized her sunbonnet and slipped out of the house and across the clearing, and the next instant she was flying down the path through the pines. She knew the road they had taken, and a path that would strike it several miles lower down. She ran like a deer, up hill and down, availing herself of every short cut, until, about an hour after she started, she came out on the road. Fortunately for her, the delays incident to getting any body of new troops on the march had detained the company, and a moment's inspection of the road showed her that they had not yet passed. Clambering up a bank, she concealed herself and lay down. In a few moments she heard the noise they made in the distance, and she was still panting from her haste when they came along, the soldiers marching in order, as if still on parade, and a considerable company of friends attending them. Not a man, however, dreamed that, flat on her face in the bushes, lay a girl peering down at them with her breath held, but with a heart which beat so loud to her own ears that she felt they must hear it. Least of all did Darby Stanley, marching erect and tall in front, for all the sore heart in his bosom, know that her eyes were on him as long as she could see him. When Vashti brought up the cow that night, it was later than usual. It perhaps was fortunate for her that the change made by the absence of the boys prevented any questioning. After all the excitement, her mother was in a fit of despondency. Her father sat in the door looking straight before him, as silent as the pine on which his vacant gaze was fixed. Even when the little cooking they had was through with, and his supper was offered him, he never spoke. He ate in silence and then took his seat again. Even Mrs. Mills's complaining about the cow straying so far brought no word from him any more than from Vashti. He sat silent as before, his long legs stretched out toward the fire. The glow of the embers fell on the rough, thin face and lit it up, bringing out the features and making them suddenly clear-cut and strong. It might have been only the fire, but there seemed the glow of something more, and the eyes burnt back under the shaggy brows. The two women likewise were silent, the elder now and then casting a glance at her husband. She offered him his pipe, but he said nothing, and silence fell as before. Presently she could stand it no longer. "I declare, Vashti," she said, "I believe your pappy takes it most harder than I does." The girl made some answer about the boys. It was hardly intended for him to hear, but he rose suddenly and, walking to the door, took down from the two dogwood forks above it his old, long, single-barreled gun, and turning to his wife said, "Get me my coat, old woman. By God, I'm a-gwine." The two women were both on their feet in a second. Their faces were white, and their hands were clenched under the sudden stress. Their breath came fast. The older woman was the first to speak. "What in the world can you do, Cove Mills, old and puny as you is, and got the rheumatiz all the time, too?" "I can point a gun," said the old man doggedly, "and I'm a-gwine." "And what in the world is a-going to become of us? And that cow got to running away so, I'm afeared all the time she'll get in the marsh." Her tone was querulous, but it was not positive, and when her husband said again, "I'm a-gwine," she said no more, and all the time she was getting together the few things which Cove would take. As for Vashti, she seemed suddenly revivified. She moved about with a new step, swift, supple, silent, her head up, a new light in her face, and her eyes, as they turned now and then on her father, filled with a new fire. She did not talk much. "I'll take care of us all," she said once, and once again, when her mother gave something like a moan, she supported her with a word about "the only ones as gives three from one family." It was a word in season, for the mother caught the spirit, and a moment later declared, with a new tone in her voice, that was better than Mrs. Stanley, and still they were better off than she, for they still had two left to help each other, while she had not a soul. "I'll take care of us all," repeated the girl once more. It was only a few things that Cove Mills took with him that morning, when he set out in the darkness to overtake the company before they should break camp, hardly his old game bag half full, for the equipment of the boys had stripped the little cabin of everything that could be of use. He might only have seemed to be going hunting, as he slung down the path with his old long-barreled gun in his hand and his game bag over his shoulder, and disappeared in the darkness from the eyes of the two women standing in the cabin door. The next morning, Mrs. Mills paid Mrs. Stanley the first visit she had paid on that side of the branch since the day, 3 years before, when Cove and the boys had the row with little Darby. It might have seemed accidental, but Mrs. Stanley was the first person in the district to know that all the Mills men were gone to the army. She went over again from time to time, for it was not a period to keep up open hostilities, and she was younger than Mrs. Stanley and better off, but Vashti never went, and Mrs. Stanley never asked after her or came. 2. The company in which Little Darby and the Millses had enlisted was one of the many hundred infantry companies which joined and were merged in the Confederate army. It was in no way particularly signalized by anything that it did. It was commanded by the gentleman who did most toward getting it up, and the officers were gentlemen. The 70-odd men who made the rank and file were of all classes, from the sons of the oldest and wealthiest planters in the neighborhood to Little Darby and the dwellers in the district. The war was very different from what those who went into it expected it to be. Until it had gone on for some time, it seemed mainly marching and camping and staying in camp, quite uselessly as seemed to many, and drilling and doing nothing. Much of the time, especially later on, was given to marching and getting food, but drilling and camp duties at first took up most of it. This was especially hard on the poorer men. No one knew what it was to them. Some moped, some fell sick. Of the former class was Little Darby. He was too strong to be sickly as one of the Mills boys was, who died of fever in hospital only 3 months after they went in, and too silent to be as the other, who was jolly and could dance and sing a good song, and was soon very popular in the company, more popular even than Old Cove, who was popular in several rights, as being about the oldest man in the company, and as having a sort of dry wit when he was in a good humor, which he generally was. Little Darby was hardly distinguished at all, unless by the fact that he was somewhat taller than most of his comrades, and somewhat more taciturn. He was only a common soldier of a common class in an ordinary infantry company, such a company as was common in the army. He still had the little wallet which he had picked up in the path that morning he left home. He had asked both the Mills boys vaguely if they ever had owned such a piece of property, but they had not, and when Old Cove told him that he had not either, he had contented himself and carried it about with him somewhat elaborately wrapped up and tied in an old piece of oilcloth and in his inside jacket pocket for safety, with a vague feeling that some day he might find the owner or return it. He was never on especially good terms with the Millses. Indeed, there was always a trace of coolness between them and him. He could not give it to them. Now and then he untied and unwrapped it in a secret place, and read a little in the Testament, but that was all. He never touched a needle or so much as a pin, and when he untied the parcel he generally counted them to see that they were all there. So the war went on, with battles coming a little oftener and food growing ever a little scarcer, but the company was about as before, nothing particular, what with killing and fever a little thinned, a good deal faded, and Little Darby just one in a crowd, marching with the rest, sleeping with the rest, fighting with the rest, starving with the rest. He was hardly known for a long time, except for his silence outside of his mess. Men were fighting and getting killed or wounded constantly. As for him, he was never touched, and as he did what he was ordered silently, and was silent when he got through, there was no one to sing his praise. Even when he was sent out on the skirmish line as a sharpshooter, if he did anything, no one knew it. He would disappear over a crest or in a wood, and reappear as silent as if he were hunting in the swamps of the district, clean his gun, cut up wood, eat what he could get, and sit by the fire and listen to the talk, as silent awake as asleep. One other thing distinguished him. He could handle an axe better than any man in the company, but no one thought much of that, least of all little Darby. It only brought him a little more work occasionally. One day, in the heat of a battle which the men knew was being won, if shooting and cheering and rapid advancing could tell anything, the advance which had been going on with spirit was suddenly checked by a murderous artillery fire which swept the top of a slope, along the crest of which ran a road a little raised between two deep ditches topped by the remains of heavy fences. The infantry, after a gallant and hopeless charge, were ordered to lie down in the ditch behind the pike, and were sheltered from the leaden sleet which swept the crest. Artillery was needed to clear the field beyond, by silencing the batteries which swept it, but no artillery could get into position for the ditches, and the day seemed about to be lost. The only way was up the pike, and the only break was a gate opening into the field right on top of the hill. The gate was gone, but two huge wooden gate posts, each a tree trunk, still stood and barred the way. No cannon had room to turn in between them. A battery had tried, and a pile of dead men, horses, and debris marked its failure. A general officer galloped up with 2 or 3 of his staff to try to start the advance again. He saw the impossibility. "If we could get a couple of batteries into that field for 3 minutes," he said, "it would do the work, but in 10 minutes it will be too late." The company from the old county was lying behind the bank almost exactly opposite the gate, and every word could be heard. Where the axe came from no one knew, but a minute later a man slung himself across the road, and the next second the sharp, steady blows of an axe were ringing on the pike. The axeman had cut a wide cleft in the brown wood, and the big chips were flying before his act was quite taken in, and then a cheer went up from the line. It was no time to cheer, however. Other chips were flying than those from the cutter's axe, and the bullets hissed by him like bees, splintering the hard post and knocking the dust from the road about his feet. But he took no notice of them. His axe plied as steadily as if he had been cutting a tree in the woods of the district, and when he had cut one side, he turned as deliberately and cut the other. Then placing his hand high up, he flung his weight against the post, and it went down. A great cheer went up, and the axeman swung back across the road just as 2 batteries of artillery tore through the opening he had made. Few men outside of his company knew who the man was, and few had time to ask, for the battle was on again, and the infantry pushed forward. As for little Darby himself, the only thing he said was, "I knowed I could cut it down in 10 minutes." He had 9 bullet holes through his clothes that night, but little Darby thought nothing of it, and neither did others. Many others had bullet holes through their bodies that night. It happened not long afterward that the general was talking of the battle to an English gentleman who had come over to see something of the war, and was visiting him in his camp, and he mentioned the incident of a battle won by an axeman's coolness, but did not know the name of the man who cut the post away. The captain of the company, however, was the general's cousin, and was dining with his guest that day, and he said with pride that he knew the man, that he was in his company, and he gave the name. "It is a fine old name," said the visitor. "And he is a fine man," said the captain, but none of this was ever known by Darby. He was not mentioned in the Gazette, because there was no Gazette. The Confederate soldiery had no honors save the approval of their own consciences and the love of their own people. It was not even mentioned in the district, or if it was only that he had cut down a post. Other men were being shot to pieces all the time, and the district had other things to think of. Poor at all times, the people of the district were now absolutely without means of subsistence. Fortunately for them, they were inured to hardship, and their men being all gone to the war, the women made such shift as they could, and lived as they might. They hoed their little patches, fished the streams, and trapped in the woods. But it was poor enough at best, and the weak went down and only the strong survived. Mrs. Mills was better off than most. She had a cow, at first, and she had Vashti. Vashti turned out to be a tower of strength. She trapped more game than anyone in the district, caught more fish with lines and traps. She went miles to fish below the forks where the fish were bigger than above. She learned to shoot with her father's old gun, which had been sent back when he got a musket. Shot like a man and better than most men. She hoed the patch, she tended the cow till it was lost, and then she did many other things. Her mother declared that, when Chris died, Chris was the boy who died of fever, but for Vashti she could not have got along at all, and there were many other women in the pines who felt the same thing. When the news came that Bob Askew was killed, Vashti was one of the first who got to Bob's wife, and when Billy Luck disappeared in a battle, Vashti gave the best reasons for thinking he had been taken prisoner, and many a string of fish and many a squirrel and hare found their way into the empty cabins because Vashti happened to pass by. From having been rather stigmatized as "that Vashti Mills," she came to be relied on, and Vashti was consulted and quoted as an authority. One cabin alone she never visited. The house of old Mrs. Stanley, now almost completely buried under its unpruned wisteria vine, she never entered. Her mother, as has been said, sometimes went across the bottom, and now and then took with her a hare or a bird or a string of fish, on condition from Vashti that it should not be known she had caught them. But Vashti never went, and Mrs. Mills found herself sometimes put to it to explain to others her unneighborliness. The best she could make of it to say that, "Vashti, she always do her own way." How Mrs. Stanley's woodpile was kept up nobody knew, if indeed it could be called a woodpile, when it was only a recurring supply of dry wood thrown as if accidentally just at the edge of the clearing. Mrs. Stanley was not of an imaginative turn, even of enough to explain how it came that so much dry wood came to be there, broken up just the right length, and Mrs. Mills knew no more than "that cow was always a-goin' off and a-keepin' Vashti a-huntin' everywheres in the world." All said, however, the women of the district had a hungry time, and the war bore on them heavily as on everyone else, and as it went on they suffered more and more. Many a woman went day after day and week after week without even the small portion of coarse corn bread which was ordinarily her common fare. They called oftener and oftener at the house of their neighbors who owned the plantations near them, and always received something, but as time went on the plantations themselves were stripped, the little things they could take with them when they went, such as eggs, honey, etc., were wanting, and to go too often without anything to give might make them seem like beggars, and that they were not. Their husbands and sons were in the army fighting for the South, as well as those from the plantations, and they stood by this fact on the same level. The arrogant looks of the negroes were unpleasant and in marked contrast to the universal graciousness of their owners, but they were slaves and they could afford to despise them. Only they must uphold their independence. Thus no one outside knew what the women of the district went through. When they wrote to their husbands or sons that they were in straits, it meant that they were starving. Such a letter meant all the more because they were used to hunger, but not to writing, and a letter meant perhaps days of thought and enterprise and hours of labor. As the war went on, the hardships everywhere grew heavier and heavier. The letters from home came oftener and oftener. Many of the men got furloughs when they were in winter quarters, and sometimes in summer, too, from wounds, and went home to see their families. Little Darby never went. He sent his mother his pay, and wrote to her, but he did not even apply for a furlough, and he had never been touched except for a couple of flesh wounds which were barely skin deep. When he heard from his mother she was always cheerful, and as he knew Vashti had never even visited her, there was no other reason for his going home. It was in the late part of the third campaign of the war that he began to think of going. End of chapter 6, part 2.